The heat in Holyhood in the late summer of 2018 was not just a temperature. It was a physical weight, pressing down on the concrete until the city felt like it was sweating out its own sins. In a city obsessed with the impossible standards of plastic perfection, Nia was a glitch in the matrix. She was a woman who took up space in a world that demanded she shrink. Dark-skinned, broad-hipped and undeniably heavy, she moved through the shimmering, superficial streets with a dignity that seemed to offend the polished elite of the district. Every glance thrown her way was a dagger of judgment, a silent critique of her body, her hair, her very existence. But Nia had learned long ago that the only way to survive a world that wanted to erase you was to walk as if the ground itself was lucky to feel your step. She was tired, bone-tired, carrying the exhaustion of 1,000 rejected job interviews and the crushing loneliness of a woman who had too much love to give and nowhere to pour it. On that particular Tuesday, the air was thick with the smog of expensive exhausts and the cloying scent of designer perfumes. Nia was waiting at a crosswalk near the Diamond District, a place she had no business being in, clutching a worn-out handbag that contained her last $20. She was just trying to cross the street, trying to get to the bus stop that would take her back to her cramped, stifling apartment on the outskirts. Suddenly, the chaotic symphony of the city, the honking, horns, the shouting vendors, the distant sirens, was severed by an eerie, sudden silence. It was the kind of silence that commanded fear. 3 matte black SUVs, armored and imposing, glided to a halt right in the middle of the intersection, blocking traffic with the arrogance of kings. The doors flew open in perfect synchronization, and a dozen men in sharp, dark suits spilled out, forming a perimeter that nobody dared to cross. They were statues of violence, their eyes hidden behind dark glasses, their hands hovering near their waistbands. Then he stepped out. Min Jun Park, the whispered nightmare of the underworld, the widowed dragon who held the city's vice in an iron grip. He was terrifyingly beautiful, with a face carved from cold marble and eyes that looked like they hadn't blinked since his wife died. He radiated a freezing coldness that seemed to drop the temperature on the street by 10 degrees. But he wasn't alone. Clinging to his impeccably tailored trouser legs were 2 identical little girls, perhaps 5 years old, dressed in lace and silk that cost more than Nia made in a year. They were delicate, porcelain dolls, with eyes that held a profound, haunting sadness, looking out at the world with a mixture of fear and curiosity. The crowd held its breath. Everyone knew who they were. The twin flowers, the heirs to an empire of blood, motherless and shielded from the world by a wall of guns and money. Nia froze, instinctively stepping back, trying to blend into the brick wall of the bakery behind her. She wanted to be invisible. She wanted to disappear before the gaze of the mob fell upon her. But the twins had stopped. They weren't looking at the terrified businessmen or the aspiring models who were preening in hopes of catching the boss's eye. They were looking straight at Nia. The little girls let go of their father's leg and took a tentative step forward, pointing their small fingers directly at her chest. The silence stretched, agonizing and sharp. Nia's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. Was she in trouble? Had she looked at them the wrong way? One of the twins, the one with a tiny blue ribbon in her hair, tilted her head. She didn't see the excess weight the world saw. She saw softness. She saw a lap that looked like a cloud. She saw a warmth that was entirely absent from the cold steel fortress of her father's life. "We want this one, Daddy," the girl said, her voice small but piercingly clear in the hush of the street. Her sister nodded vigorously, her eyes wide and pleading. "Yes, the soft lady, we want her." A ripple of shock went through the crowd. Whispers erupted like hissing steam. "Her? The fat woman? Is this a joke?" Min Jun slowly turned his head, his gaze following the direction of his daughter's fingers. When his eyes locked onto Nia, she felt as if she were being scanned by a predator. There was no lust, no mockery, only a ruthless calculation. He looked at her worn shoes, her simple dress, her trembling hands, and then up to her eyes. He was searching for weakness, but in Nia's terrified gaze, he found something else, a defiant spark of survival. He looked down at his daughters, seeing the desperation in their grip, The first time in 2 years they had shown interest in anything other than their grief. He didn't ask Nia if she wanted a job. He didn't ask for her resume. He simply snapped his fingers. 2 of the suited men materialized at Nia's side before she could even gasp. "Please, I didn't do anything," she stammered, panic rising in her throat, but the men were gentle, firm, and completely deaf to her protest. "The boss requires your presence," one of them murmured, guiding her, almost carrying her, toward the middle SUV. The absurdity of it washed over her. She was being kidnapped or hired or arrested. She couldn't tell which. As she was ushered into the leather-scented darkness of the vehicle, she caught one last glimpse of the crowd, the disgust on. Their faces had been replaced by bewildered envy and fear. The door slammed shut, sealing her in a soundproof box with the most dangerous man in the city and 2 little girls who were staring at her as if she were a magical creature. The ride to the penthouse was a blur of neon lights streaking past tinted windows. The silence inside the car was heavy. Minjun sat opposite her, typing on a phone, completely ignoring her presence, yet Nia felt the weight of his awareness. The twins, however, sat on either side of her. Hesitantly, the one with the blue ribbon reached out and touched Nia's arm, testing the reality of her. Nia, despite her fear, felt that old instinctive maternal ache bloom in her chest. She looked down and offered a shaky, genuine smile. The little girl didn't pull away. She leaned in. It was a small gesture, but in the ecosystem of the Park family, it was an earthquake. When the car finally stopped, they were in the belly of a skyscraper that pierced the clouds. Nia was escorted up a private elevator that opened directly into a penthouse that was less a home and more a museum of isolation. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of Holyhood, looking like a bed of embers far below. The furniture was sharp-edged, modern and monochrome. There were no toys, no mess, no color. It was a fortress of solitude. The staff, maids, guards, chefs, stood in lined formation, bowing deeply as Minjun entered. They looked at Nia with open hostility. To them, she was an aberration, a stain on the pristine aesthetic of their master's world. They sneered at her cheap clothes and her size, their eyes saying what they didn't dare speak. "You don't belong here." Minjun turned to her, removing his suit jacket with a fluid, weary motion. "My daughters have chosen you," he said, his voice a deep baritone that vibrated in the large empty room. "I do not know why. I have hired the best governesses from Europe. They lasted days. The girls screamed until they left. He stepped closer, towering over her, his scent of sandalwood and gunpowder filling her senses. "You will be their nanny. You will live here. You will not leave this building without an escort. You will be paid more in a month than you have earned in your entire life." He paused, his eyes narrowing into slits of obsidian. "But make no mistake, if you hurt them, if you neglect them, if you allow even a shadow of danger to fall upon them, there is no place on this earth you can hide from me." Note. Swallowed hard, her throat dry. She should run. She should demand to be let go. But then she felt a small hand slip into hers. She looked down. Both twins were holding onto her skirt, looking up at their father with a mixture of defiance and hope. They had chosen her. In a world that discarded her, these 2 broken children had seen her as a prize. Nia squared her shoulders, lifting her chin. She wasn't just a victim of circumstance anymore. She was needed. "I don't need your threats, sir," she said, her voice trembling but gaining strength with every word. "I know how to love a child. That seems to be the one thing you can't buy for them." The silence that followed was deafening. The guards stiffened, hands twitching toward weapons. No one spoke to the dragon like that. Minjun stared at her, a flicker of surprise passing behind his cold mask. For a second, the air crackled with the threat of violence. Then he turned his back on her. "Show her to her room," he commanded the head of security, walking away into the shadows of his study. "And get her clothes that fit." As Nia was led down the endless marble hallway, dragging her battered handbag, she realized the magnitude of what had just happened. She had entered the lion's den, not as prey but as a keeper. The door to her room clicked shut and she sank onto the plush bed, her heart racing. She was in the center of the web now. Outside her door, A criminal empire churned. Inside, 2 little girls were starving for affection. And somewhere in the dark, a man with a frozen heart was waiting to see if she would melt the ice or be crushed by it. This was no longer just a job, it was a game of survival, and the first move had just been made. The first morning in the penthouse broke not with the gentle caress of sunlight, but with the sterile hum of the central air conditioning system, a sound that reminded Nia she was far from the noisy, vibrant streets of her neighborhood. She woke in a bed that felt like a cloud, the sheets made of Egyptian cotton so fine they felt like water against her skin. For a moment, suspended in the haze of sleep, she forgot where she was. Then, the memory of the matte black SUVs and the piercing eyes of Minjun Park crashed back into her consciousness. She wasn't dreaming. She was in the sky fortress of the city's most dangerous man, hired on the whim of 2 5-year-old girls. Nia sat up, her feet sinking into the plush carpet. She had barely washed her face when there was a sharp, perfunctory knock at the door. Before she could answer, a woman entered. It was Ms. Kim, the head housekeeper, a woman whose face seemed permanently pinched in an expression of mild distaste. Behind her trailed 2 younger assistants, pushing a rack of clothing. They didn't greet Nia. They simply assessed her, their eyes raking over her curves with a mixture of confusion and judgment. "The master has ordered a wardrobe suitable for the staff," Ms. Kim announced, her voice clipping. "The air." She gestured to the rack. It was filled with drab, oversized grey tunics and shapeless trousers, garments designed to hide, to erase, to make the wearer indistinguishable from the furniture. "You will wear these. We must maintain the aesthetic." Nia stood up, wrapping her robe tighter around her body. The old Nia, the one beaten down by rejection letters and the sneers of Holyhood's elite, might have bowed her head and accepted the uniform. But something had shifted in that car ride. She had been chosen. "No," Nia said, her voice quiet but firm. Ms. Kim blinked, stunned. "Excuse me." "I said no," Nia repeated, walking over to the rack and fingering the coarse fabric of the tunics. "These aren't clothes. They are apologies. I am not something to be hidden, Ms. Kim. The girls didn't point at a shadow, they pointed at me. If Mr. Park wants me to care for his children, I will do it as myself, not as a grey ghost." She turned to the housekeeper, her dark eyes blazing. "You can. Bring me clothes that fit my body and the dignity of this job, or you can explain to the twins why the soft lady they asked for is gone." It was a gamble, a terrifying one, but it paid off. Ms. Kim's mouth tightened into a thin line, but she snapped her fingers at the assistants. "Measure her, properly." By the time Nia emerged from her room an hour later, she was wearing a simple but elegant navy dress that hugged her waist and flowed over her hips. She looked regal, a stark contrast to the sharp angles of the penthouse. She made her way to the nursery, a room that broke her heart the moment she stepped inside. It was vast, filled with the most expensive toys money could buy: electric cars, life-sized dollhouses, robotic pets, but it was utterly devoid of joy. The twins, whom she learned were named Hana and Yuna, sat in the center of the room on a pristine white rug, staring at a tablet screen. They looked like exhibits in a museum, terrified to make a mess. When Nia entered, their heads snapped up. The guarded look in their eyes vanished, replaced by that same desperate curiosity from the street. Nia didn't rush them. She sat down on the floor, ignoring the creak of her knees, and simply opened her arms. Yuna, the bolder of the two, moved first, scrambling across the rug and burying her face in Nia's neck. Hana followed a second later. They smelled of expensive lavender soap, but underneath there was the scent of loneliness. Nia held them, rocking gently, humming a low, soulful tune her grandmother used to sing. For the first time in the sterile history of that room, the air felt warm. Over the next few weeks, a silent war began within the penthouse walls. On one side was the cold, regimented order of Minjun's empire. On the other was the chaotic, vibrant warmth Nia brought with her. The staff watched her with hawk-like intensity, waiting for her to fail, to break something, to prove that a woman from the slums couldn't handle the high-stakes world of the Park family. But Nia possessed a weapon they didn't understand: emotional intelligence. She saw the way the twins flinched at loud noises, a trauma response to the violence that had taken their mother. She noticed how they barely ate the gourmet, deconstructed meals prepared by the Michelin star chef. One afternoon, Nia marched into the kitchen, a gleaming laboratory of steel and chrome. The chef, a man who treated his knives better than his assistants, bristled. "This is a restricted area," he spat. "The girls aren't eating," Nia said, rolling up her sleeves. "Foie gras and truffles are fine for gala dinners, but they are children. They need comfort." Ignoring the chef's spluttering protests, Nia found a bag of rice, some chicken, and simple spices. She made a pot of juk, a savory rice porridge, but she made it the way her neighbors in Holyhood made comfort food, with patience and soul. When she served it to the girls, the smell of sesame oil and chicken broth wafted through the dining room, cutting through the sterile atmosphere. Minjun, who usually took his meals in his study, walked in, drawn by the scent. He stood in the doorway, a silent spectre in a charcoal suit. He watched as his daughters, who usually picked at their food like birds, devoured the bowls, their faces smeared with broth, laughing as Nia pretended to steal spoonfuls. It was a domestic scene so alien to him that he didn't know how to process it. He should have been angry at the breach of protocol. Instead, he felt a strange, dull ache in his chest, the thawing of a glacier. He caught Nia's eye across the table. She didn't look away or cower. She offered him a small nod, a silent challenge: join us, or stay in the cold. He turned and left without a word, but that night, the chef was ordered to let Nia cook whenever she pleased. However, the world outside the penthouse was not as easily won over. News of the unconventional nanny had leaked to the gossip columns and the whispers of the underworld. Nia was an anomaly, a black plus-sized woman in the center of a Korean Mafia dynasty. When she had to take the girls to their private elite school, the tension was palpable. The other mothers, wives of politicians and tech moguls, looked at her with thinly veiled disgust. They whispered behind manicured hands, their eyes darting from Nia's natural hair to her figure. "Is that the help?" one woman murmured, loud enough to be heard, her voice dripping with venom. "I heard Minjun finally lost his mind, letting someone like that raise the heirs." Nia tightened her grip on the girl's hands. She could feel Hana trembling. Nia knelt down right there on the sidewalk, ignoring the stares. "Look at me," she told the twins, her voice fierce and low. "Do you see those people? They are small inside. Their hearts are tiny. You are the daughters of a dragon. You walk with your heads up. You define who you are, not them. Do you understand?" Yuna nodded, mimicking Nia's serious expression. "Heads up," the little girl whispered. They walked past the gossiping women with a newfound strut, a tiny imitation of Nia's own powerful gait. Nia didn't know it, but from the back of the tinted sedan idling at the curb, Minjun was watching the feed from the bodyguard's lapel camera. He saw the insults. He saw Nia absorb the hate meant for his family and convert it into armor for his daughters. His grip on the leather armrest tightened until the leather creaked. He had hired a nanny, but he was beginning to realize he had acquired a lioness. The shift in the house became undeniable. The silence was broken more often now, by giggles, by the sound of cartoons Nia introduced them to, by the smell of baking cookies. Nia started leaving things around the house, a colorful throw blanket on the austere gray sofa, a vase of wild sunflowers on the hallway table, small acts of rebellion against the gloom. One rainy evening, the power of this change came to a head. A thunderstorm was battering the city, the lightning turning the sky purple. The twins were terrified. Nia had built a blanket fort in the middle of the living room, using the expensive cushions from the Italian sofa to create a bunker against the thunder. They were inside with flashlights, reading a story. Minjun returned home late, his suit soaked, his face grim from a meeting with the erratic heads of the triad. He walked into his living room expecting the usual dark void. Instead, he found an illuminated tent made of his best furniture. He stopped, water dripping from his coat onto the marble. "Who goes there?" a voice squeaked from inside the fort. It was Hana. "Friend or foe?" Yuna added, giggling. Min-jun stood frozen. He was the most feared man in the city. People didn't ask him if he was a friend. They prayed he wasn't a foe. Before he could speak, Nia's head poked out from the blankets. Her hair was messy, and she looked tired, but her eyes were warm. "It's just your dad," Nia whispered to the girls. Then she looked up at him, risking everything. "Come in, sir. The fortress is secure, but we need a dragon to guard the gate." The guards by the elevator held their breath. This was it. She had gone too far. Min-jun stared at the woman who had turned his architectural masterpiece into a campground. He looked at the hopeful faces of his daughters, peeking out from behind her. Slowly, meticulously, the dragon of Holyhood unbuttoned his jacket. He loosened his tie. He kicked off his expensive shoes. And then, to the utter shock of his security detail, Min-jun Park got down on his hands and knees and crawled into the blanket fort. For an hour, there was no mafia, no turf wars, no grief. There was just a man, a woman, and two little girls hiding from the thunder. In the dim light of the flashlight, Min-jun watched Nia reading to his children. He saw the curve of her cheek, the softness of her hands, the way she made his daughters feel safe in a way his guns never could. He realized with a jolt of terror that he was no longer just tolerating her presence. He was needing it. But outside the warm makeshift tent, the city was not sleeping. In the shadows of Holyhood, a rival gang, the Red Vipers, were watching the penthouse. They had seen the weakness. They had seen the domesticity. They saw a man distracted by playing house, and as the thunder rolled over the city, masking the sound of engines revving in the distance, the Vipers prepared to strike. Nia had brought warmth to the ice palace, but warmth melts ice, and without the ice the defenses were thinner than anyone realized. The happiness blooming in the penthouse was about to be tested by fire. The weeks that followed the stormy night in the blanket fort were a surreal haze of domestic tranquility superimposed over a map of violence. Nia had become the gravitational center of the penthouse, her laughter echoing in hallways that had previously only known the click of polished shoes and the whisper of conspiracy. But the world outside was not so kind. The annual Winter Solstice Gala was approaching, a mandatory event for the city's power players, and for the first time, Min-jun insisted that his daughters attend, and where the daughters went, Nia went. The venue was the Crystal Palace, a towering structure of glass and steel in the heart of Holyhood, suspended above the grimy streets like a chandelier in a slaughterhouse. Nia stood near the buffet table, feeling like an exposed nerve. She was wearing a custom-made gown of deep emerald velvet, chosen by Min-jun himself. It was modest yet striking, draping over her curves in a way that commanded attention. But the attention she received was sharp and stinging. The city's elite, women who starved themselves to fit into sample sizes, and men who viewed wives as accessories, circled her like sharks. Their whispers were loud, designed to be heard. "That's the nanny. She looks like she ate the previous one," a socialite giggled behind her. "Champagne flute. Disgraceful. Min-jun insults us by bringing the help, especially that kind of help." Nia gripped her clutch until her knuckles turned white. She scanned the room for the twins. Hana and Yuna were being paraded around by Min-jun, who looked dashing and deadly in a midnight blue tuxedo. He was holding court with politicians and rival gang leaders, a shark swimming among piranhas. Every few minutes his eyes would dart across the room, locking onto Nia, checking on her. It wasn't a look of romance, but of possessive assurance. "Are you safe?" "Good." But Nia felt anything but safe. The air in the ballroom was too thin, too perfumed, too full of hidden knives. Suddenly the lights flickered. A low, thrumming sound vibrated through the floorboards, shaking the champagne in the glasses. Most guests laughed, blaming the old city grid, but Nia felt the hair on her arms stand up. It was an instinct honed by years of walking home alone in dangerous neighborhoods, the primal awareness that the predator was near. She looked at Min-jun. He had stopped talking mid-sentence. His hand went to his ear, tapping his hidden earpiece. His expression shifted from polite boredom to feral alert. Then the world exploded. The massive glass skylight above the ballroom shattered inward. raining shards of razor-sharp crystal down onto the screaming crowd. At the same moment, the service doors were kicked open. Men in red bandanas and tactical gear poured in, their automatic rifles spitting. Fire into the ceiling, the Red Vipers. It wasn't a robbery, it was an execution. Chaos erupted. The civilized veneer of the elite vanished instantly, replaced by a stampede of terrified animals. People shoved, trampled, and clawed over each other to get to the exits. Nia didn't run for the door. She ran into the storm. "Hannah! Yuna!" she screamed, her voice tearing through the cacophony of gunfire and breaking glass. She saw them. They were frozen near the center of the room, separated from their father by a falling lighting rig that had crashed between them. Minjun was engaging 3 attackers, his movements a blur of lethal martial arts, snapping limbs and disarming men with terrifying efficiency, but he was cut off. He roared his daughters' names, his face a mask of pure agony as he tried to fight his way through the wall of bodies and debris. He couldn't reach them, but Nia could. Adrenaline, cold and sharp, flooded her veins. She moved with a speed that defied her size, bulldozing through a group of panicked businessmen who blocked her path. She reached the girls just as a Viper spotted them. The gunman grinned, raising his rifle. The heirs, the ultimate leverage. "Get down!" Nia shrieked. She didn't think. She didn't calculate the odds. She tackled the twins, using her own body as a shield, slamming them to the floor behind an overturned heavy oak banquet table. Bullets chewed into the wood inches from her head, sending splinters flying into her hair. The girls were screaming, a high-pitched sound of pure terror that shattered Nia's heart. "Look at me," Nia commanded, grabbing their faces with trembling hands. "We are going to play a game, the quiet game. We have to move. Now." She dragged them, crawling on hands and knees through the carnage, aiming for the kitchen entrance. The ballroom was a kill box. Smoke grenades had been deployed, filling the air with acrid grey fog. It was blinding, but it was also cover. Nia kept her body hunched over the girls, a human canopy. Every time a shot rang out, she flinched, expecting the burn of metal, but she kept moving. They burst into the industrial kitchen, expecting safety, but found a nightmare. A Viper was there, guarding the rear exit. He was huge, his face obscured by a red mask. He saw them, a woman and 2 children, and leveled a pistol at them. "End of the line, sweetheart," he sneered, his finger tightening on the trigger. Nia looked around. No weapons, no guards, just stainless steel and steam. The twins buried their faces in her dress. This was it. She pushed the girls behind a metal prep counter and stood up. She rose to her full height, breathing heavily, her emerald dress torn and stained. "Don't you touch them," she growled, a sound so guttural it surprised even her. The gunman laughed, stepping closer. "Or what? You gonna sit on me?" He underestimated her. He saw fat. He didn't see mass. He saw a woman. He didn't see a mother defending her cubs. As he stepped within range, distracted by his own cruelty, Nia didn't back away. She lunged. She grabbed a pot of boiling stock from the industrial stove next to her and swung it with every ounce of hysterical strength she possessed. The scalding liquid hit him square in the chest and face. He screamed, dropping the gun as he clawed at his burning skin. Nia didn't stop. She grabbed a heavy cast-iron skillet and swung it like a hammer, bringing it down on his head with a sickening crunch. The man crumbled to the floor. Unconscious. Nia gasped for air, her chest heaving. She had done it. She turned back to the counter where the girls were hiding. "It's okay, baby, it's—" The back door burst open. 2 more Vipers. They didn't hesitate. They saw their fallen comrade and raised their rifles. Nia realized instantly she was too far from the girls to grab them and run. They were exposed. The shooters aimed at the twins. There was no time to think, no time to pray. Nia threw herself across the gap. She didn't dive for cover. She dove in front of the bullets. Pop, pop, pop. The sound was dull, final. Nia felt a sledgehammer slam into her shoulder, then another into her side. The force spun her around, and she hit the cold tile floor hard. The world turned white, then red. She couldn't feel her legs. She could only hear the twins screaming her name. "Nia! Mama Nia!" The Vipers stepped forward to finish the job, to kill the witnesses. But before they could fire again, a shadow fell over them. The kitchen doors from the ballroom exploded outward. Min Jun stood there. He was bleeding from a cut on his forehead, his tuxedo shredded, a demon rising from hell. He saw Nia on the floor, her emerald dress turning black with blood. He saw his daughters clinging to her limp hand. The sound that left Min Jun's throat was not human. It was the roar of a beast whose soul had been touched. He didn't use a gun. He closed the distance to the Vipers before they could retarget. What followed was not a fight. It was a massacre. He dismantled them with his bare hands, driven by a rage so cold and absolute that the room seemed to freeze. In seconds, the threat was neutralized. Min Jun fell to his knees beside Nia. His hands, usually so steady, were shaking violently as he pressed them against her wounds, trying to stem the flow of crimson. "Nia, Nia, look at me," he commanded, his voice cracking. The ice was gone. The dragon was panicked. Nia blinked, her vision swimming. She saw Min Jun's face, stripped of all its masks. She saw fear. She saw the twins, unhurt, crying, touching her face with their small hands. "The girls," Nia whispered, blood bubbling past her lips. They are safe. You saved them," Min Jun choked out, tears mixing with the blood on his hands. "You foolish brave woman, why did you do that?" "Because," Nia smiled weakly, her eyes drifting shut as the pain began to fade into a cold numbness. "They wanted the soft one." "Stay with me," Min Jun yelled, lifting her head. "Medics! Now, if she dies, everyone dies!" The shouting faded into a hum. The last thing Nia felt was the sensation of being lifted, not by guards, but by Min Jun himself. He carried her out of the kitchen, through the ruined ballroom, past the stunned survivors. He didn't care about his image. He didn't care about the blood soaking his shirt. He held her against his chest like she was the most precious thing in his empire, barking orders, demanding a path. As consciousness slipped away, Nia realized the dynamic had indeed shifted. She wasn't the help anymore. She had bled for the throne, and the king knew it. The antiseptic sting of the private intensive care unit was a sharp contrast to the metallic scent of blood that still clung to Min Jun's clothes. For 3 days, the Dragon of Holyhood had not showered, shaved, or slept. He sat in a hard plastic chair beside the bed, his body a coiled spring of tension, watching the rhythmic rise and fall of Nia's chest. She was hooked, up to a constellation of machines, tubes snaking from her arms and nose, the steady beep-beep-beep of the heart monitor, the only thing tethering his sanity to the earth. She looked pale, her skin ash-grey against the stark white sheets, but she was alive. The doctors had removed 2 bullets, one from her shoulder, one that had grazed her ribs and lodged in her hip. They said she was lucky. Min Jun didn't feel lucky. He felt a cold, consuming rage at the world that had dared to hurt her, and a deeper, more terrifying terror at the thought of a life without her. Hannah and Yuna were asleep on a cot in the corner of the room, curled together like kittens. Even in their sleep they whimpered, their hands reaching out for a comfort that Min Jun knew he wasn't equipped to give. Only Nia could chase away the nightmares. The silence was broken by the sound of the heavy security doors sliding open. Min Jun didn't turn around. He knew who it was by the cadence of the footsteps. Slow, deliberate, arrogant. The council. The elders of the organization who had watched his rise to power and now, presumably, had come to critique his near fall. "Min Jun," a rasping voice called out. It was Elder Choi, the oldest and most traditional of the advisors. "This vigil is unbecoming. You have a business to run. The streets are whispering that the dragon is weeping over a servant." Min Jun slowly stood up. His joints popped. He turned to face the 3 men standing in the doorway. They were impeccable. In their suits, their faces masks of distaste as they looked past him at the unconscious woman in the bed. To them, Nia was clutter. She was a liability. "She is not a servant," Min Jun said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in his chest. "She is the reason my daughters are breathing air right now instead of being measured for coffins." Elder Choi stepped forward, leaning on his cane. He looked at Nia with unmasked prejudice, his eyes lingering on her size, her dark skin, the sheer difference of her. She was useful, yes. She took a bullet. That is what paid help is for. But look at this mess, Minjun. You were attacked at the gala. The Red Vipers sensed weakness because you have been playing house. You brought this woman into our circle. She does not fit. She is an embarrassment to the aesthetic, to the lineage. The elite are laughing. They say the Park family has lost its standards. The other elders nodded. Pay her off, another suggested coldly. Give her a generous settlement for her injuries and send her back to the slums where she belongs. Get a proper governess, someone who understands our world, someone who looks the part. The air in the room seemed to drop to absolute zero. Minjun walked toward them. He didn't rush. He moved with the predatory grace of a tiger stalking a herd of oblivious deer. He stopped inches from Elder Choi's face. The older man flinched, smelling the dried blood and the raw violence radiating from his boss. You talk. To have standards, Minjun whispered, and the sound was more terrifying than a scream. You talk of appearances. You look at her and you see someone who doesn't fit your narrow, superficial definition of worth. You see her weight and you think lazy. You see her skin and you think outsider. You are blind. He gestured violently toward the bed. When the bullets started flying, where were you, Choi? You were cowering under a table. Where were my highly paid standard bodyguards? Half of them. Aran. But that woman who you say doesn't fit? She didn't hesitate. She didn't calculate her odds. She threw her body, the body you despise, over my children. She turned herself into a shield. Minjun's voice rose, cracking with emotion. You say she is weak. She has more courage in her little finger than this entire council has in its collective soul. You speak of alliances. There is no alliance on this earth worth more than the loyalty she bled onto that kitchen floor. The elite are laughing. Let them laugh. If anyone speaks a word of disrespect against her again, I will cut out their tongues. She is not the help. She is the savior of this house, and she stays. The elders stood stunned, their mouths agape. They had expected a negotiation. They got a decree. Minjun glared at them until they looked away, shamed by the ferocity of his conviction. Get out, he snarled, and tell the vipers that the dragon is awake, and he is coming for them. As the elders retreated, cowed and silent, a soft groan came from the bed. Minjun spun around, the rage evaporating instantly, replaced by a desperate hope. Nia's eyelids fluttered. She grimaced, a sound of pain escaping her lips. Nia? Minjun was at her side in a second, his hand hovering over hers, afraid to touch her and cause more pain. I'm here. You're safe. Nia opened her eyes. The bright hospital lights made her squint. Her mouth felt like it was filled with cotton, and her shoulder throbbed with a fiery pulse. It took a moment for the memories to reassemble. The gala, the gun, the burning stock, the bullets. Her eyes widened. The girls, she rasped, her voice a broken whisper. They are sleeping. Right there. Minjun pointed to the cot. You saved them, Nia. You saved them all. Nia let out a breath she didn't know she was holding, her body relaxing into the mattress. She looked up at Minjun. She had never seen him look like this. Disheveled, eyes red-rimmed, his mask of perfection completely shattered. He looked human. He looked like a man who had stared into the abyss. You look terrible, boss, she managed to joke, though it came out as a wheeze. Minjun let out a wet, choked laugh. He took her hand, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. I feel terrible. I thought I lost you. He paused, his gaze intense. I heard what they said. The doctors, the nurses, even my advisors. They think you don't belong in this life. They think it's too dangerous. Maybe they're right, Nia whispered, looking at the ceiling. I'm just a nanny from the hood, Minjun. I don't know how to dodge bullets. I was just terrified. Courage is not the absence of fear, Minjun said, quoting a proverb she didn't know. It is acting in spite of it. You belong here, Nia, not because I pay you, but because you are the only real thing I have found in a lifetime of lies. He squeezed her hand. Do not leave us, please. It was a plea, naked and vulnerable. Nia looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the lonely man behind the myth. She realized that she wasn't just healing from a gunshot wound, she was healing a family. "I'm not going anywhere," she promised. 2 weeks later, the day of her discharge arrived. The media had been in a frenzy. The mystery heroine of the Crystal Palace massacre was the headline on every news station. Speculation was rampant. Was she a secret agent? A hidden mistress? A bodyguard? Min Jun had forbidden any leaks, but the curiosity of the city was at a boiling point. Nia sat in a wheelchair dressed in a soft, comfortable tracksuit Min Jun had ordered for her, high quality but practical. Her arm was in a sling. She felt self-conscious. "Do we have to go out the front?" she asked Min Jun, who was adjusting the blanket over her lap. "We do," Min Jun said, standing up. He was back in his suit, his armor restored, but his eyes were softer when they looked at her. "We do not hide. Not anymore. Let them see." He signaled to the security team. The automatic doors of the hospital slid open. A wall of flashing lights and shouting reporters erupted. "Mr. Park, who is the woman? Is she safe? What is her relationship to the family?" Nia flinched, instinctively wanting to cover her face. She was bruised, she was tired, and she felt heavy and unpolished compared to the glossy reporters. But then she felt a hand on her shoulder, not a guard's hand, Min Jun's hand. He didn't walk ahead of her. He walked beside the wheelchair, his hand resting protectively, possessively on her shoulder. He glared at the cameras with a look that dared them to find a flaw. He stopped right in the middle of the phalanx of microphones. The crowd went silent, waiting for the soundbite. "This," Min Jun said, his voice carrying over the crowd without a microphone, clear and commanding, "is Nia. She is the heart of my family. Anyone who wishes to be an enemy of hers is an enemy of mine, and you know what happens to my enemies." He didn't call her the nanny. He didn't qualify her position. He called her the heart. He nodded to his driver and they moved forward. As they reached the waiting SUV, the twins, who had been waiting inside, scrambled out, ignoring protocol. "Nia!" they shouted, rushing to the wheelchair. They hugged her good arm, burying their faces in her lap, oblivious to the cameras clicking furiously. The image that hit the front page the next morning wasn't of a crime boss and his employee. It was a picture of a family. A tall, formidable man standing guard, 2 beautiful children clinging to a woman who defied every standard of hoolihood beauty, yet looked more regal in her tracksuit and bandages than any queen in the city. Back in the penthouse, things were different. The staff no longer looked at her with disdain, they looked at her with a mix of fear and awe. She was the woman who took a bullet for the heirs. She was untouchable. But the biggest change was in Min Jun. He started coming home. Earlier. He started sitting in the living room while she read to the girls. The boundaries were dissolving. One evening, as Nia was folding laundry, a task she insisted on doing herself, despite her injury because it kept her grounded, Min Jun entered the room. He held a small velvet box. He didn't look like the confident boss who had silenced the press. He looked nervous. "Nia," he started, standing awkwardly by the doorframe. "The council. They advised me to form a marriage alliance. To secure our position after the attack. To merge with the Busan Syndicate." Nia felt a cold stone drop in her stomach. Of course, this was the reality. He was a king. He needed a queen of noble blood. "Oh," she said, focusing intently on a pair of socks. That makes sense. Business is business, right?" "It is," Min Jun agreed, stepping closer. "But I told them that the position is already filled by the only person who is qualified." Nia stopped folding. She turned to look at him, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm. "I don't understand." "I broke the rules for you, Nia. I broke the expectations. I broke the mold." He opened the box. Inside wasn't a diamond. It was a ring made of twisted black gold and raw emerald, resilient and unique. "I do not want an alliance. I want a partner. I want the woman who loves my children as her own. I want the woman who brings warmth to this cold grave of a house." He didn't kneel. Kings don't kneel. But he bowed his head, a gesture of supreme submission and respect. "Will you take this burden? Will you take this life? Will you take me? The proposal hung in the air, heavier than the smog of the city, sweeter than the victory over death. The dragon was asking to be tamed. And Nia, the girl from the block who had been invisible her whole life, realized she was finally being seen. Fully, completely seen. The silence in the penthouse was thick, but for the first time since Nia had arrived in this tower of glass and steel, it wasn't. Cold. It was heavy with the weight of a destiny being rewritten. Nia looked at the ring in the velvet box, raw emerald and black gold, a collision of earth and darkness, and then up at the man who offered it. Min Jun Park, the dragon who terrified a city, was looking at her with the terrified vulnerability of a boy. He wasn't asking for a trophy wife to display at galas. He was asking for a partner to help him hold up the sky. "I am not a queen, Min Jun," Nia said softly, her voice trembling but clear. "I come from the cracked pavement of Holyhood. I don't know the etiquette of your court. I don't know how to sip tea with women who want me dead. If I say yes, I bring my world with me. I bring my noise, my size, my history. I won't shrink to fit your throne." Min Jun stepped forward, closing the distance. He reached out and took the hand that wasn't in a sling, bringing it to his lips. "That is exactly what I am counting on," he murmured against her skin. "I do not need another. Porcelain doll. Porcelain breaks. I need the rock that broke the wave. I need you." Nia felt the tears prick her eyes, hot and fast. She looked over Min Jun's shoulder to the hallway, where Hannah and Yuna were peeking around the corner, their eyes wide with anticipation. They were holding their breath. Nia smiled, a radiant, full-faced smile that transformed the room. "Then yes," she whispered. "Yes, we'll rewrite the rules." The news of the engagement hit the city like a seismic wave. The tabloids went wild. The elite sneered in disbelief and the underworld held its breath. The nanny from the hood was marrying the king. It was the ultimate Cinderella story, but twisted into a dark, gritty fairy tale where the prince carried a semi-automatic and the princess had scars from bullet wounds. The wedding date was set for a month later. It was to be held at the Park Ancestral Estate on the outskirts of the city, a fortress surrounded by cherry blossom trees that were currently bare, and skeletal in the winter chill. The preparation was a war in itself. Ms. Kim, the housekeeper who had once tried to put Nia in a grey uniform, now found herself weeping with emotion as she helped fit the wedding dress. It was a masterpiece designed not to hide Nia, but to celebrate her. A deep, ivory silk gown with a structured bodice that accentuated her curves, embroidered with golden threads that formed the pattern of phoenix wings rising from ash. "You look formidable, madam," Ms. Kim said, wiping her eyes. "I look like myself," Nia corrected gently, looking in the mirror. For the first time, she didn't see the fat girl society had told her to hate. She saw a matriarch. The day of the wedding dawned grey and steel-cold, typical for Holyhood. The estate was a fortress of luxury, but beneath the surface it was a loaded weapon. Security was tighter than a bank vault. Every guest was screened, every flower arrangement checked for explosives. The guest list was a bizarre mix. The terrifying heads of the 5 families sat on one side, grim and silent. On the other, a few of Nia's old neighbours from the block, looking terrified but proud, dressed in their Sunday best. The ceremony was held in the great hall. As the music began, a haunting cello melody, the doors opened. Hannah and Yuna walked down the aisle first, scattering not rose petals, but small golden origami stars Nia had taught them to fold. They looked like angels, but their chins were high, their eyes sharp. They were Parks through and through. Then came Nia. She walked alone. She refused to be given away by anyone. She walked with a slow, rhythmic cadence, her head held high, the golden phoenix on her dress catching the light. A murmur went through the crowd. The sheer presence of her silenced the whispers. She didn't look like an intruder anymore. She looked like she owned the very air they breathed. Min Jun waited at the altar, dressed in a traditional black hanbok embroidered with silver. Dragons. When he saw her, his stoic mask cracked. A look of pure, unadulterated worship washed over his face. When she reached him, he didn't wait for the priest. He reached out and took both her hands. My equal, he whispered, loud enough for the front row to hear. The vows were exchanged, not in poetic verse, but in promises of blood and iron, to protect, to defend, to rule together. But as Minjun slipped the emerald ring onto Nia's finger, the heavy oak doors at the back of the hall slammed. Open! The music died instantly. A cold wind swept into the room. Standing in the doorway was the leader of the Red Vipers, a scarred man known as the Butcher, flanked by 20 of his most heavily armed men. They had bypassed the outer security. Betrayal. A touching scene, the Butcher sneered, his voice echoing in the vaulted hall. But I think the groom forgot to send me an invitation. We figured we'd come to the funeral instead. Panic rippled through the guests. Nia's neighbors screamed. The Mafia dons reached for weapons they had been forced to leave at the door. But Minjun didn't flinch. He didn't even turn fully around. He kept his eyes locked on Nia's. I told you, Minjun said calmly to his bride, that I would give you the world. But first I must clean it. Nia didn't scream, she didn't faint. She squeezed his hands. Do what you must, husband. Minjun turned. He looked at the Butcher with a look of bored disappointment. You think you broke in here? Minjun asked. His voice calm but projecting to every corner of the room. You think you bypassed my security. You think the dragon sleeps on his wedding day. The Butcher hesitated, sensing a trap too late. Kill them all, he roared, raising his rifle. But before a single trigger could be pulled, the stained glass windows high above shattered inward, not from bullets, but from repelling lines. The waiters, serving champagne, drew submachine guns from their serving trays. The priest pulled a shotgun from behind the altar. In a terrifying display of coordination, the Park family's elite guard, who had been hiding in plain sight, unleashed hell. It wasn't a battle. It was an extermination. It lasted less than 30 seconds. The Red Vipers were cut down in a crossfire so precise it seemed choreographed. Nia stood at the altar, shielding the twins who had run to her, her eyes wide but unflinching. She watched the violence not with enjoyment, but with the grim acceptance of her new reality. She was the queen of a violent kingdom, and a queen does not look away when her enemies are destroyed. When the silence returned, thick with the smell of gunpowder and fear, the Butcher lay wounded at the foot of the aisle. Minjun walked down the steps, avoiding the blood on the marble floor. He stood over his enemy. You interrupted my wife, Minjun said coldly. She was about to kiss me. He signaled to his head of security. Remove this trash. The ceremony is not over. As the bodies were dragged away with efficient speed, and the staff, unfazed, began to clean the floor, the guests sat in stunned, terrified silence. Minjun walked back to the altar. He took a handkerchief from his pocket and wiped a speck of blood from his cheek. Then he turned to Nia. I apologize for the disruption, he said, his voice returning to that soft baritone he saved only for her. Nia looked at him, then out at the room of powerful, dangerous people who were now staring at her with a newfound fear. They realized that she wasn't just the woman Minjun loved. She was the woman who stood still while bullets flew. She was the woman who had accepted the monster and the man. It's not a hooly hood wedding without a little drama, Nia quipped, her voice shaky but loud. A nervous ripple of laughter went through the crowd. The tension broke. Minjun smiled, a real, dazzling smile. He cupped her face and kissed her. It was a kiss that tasted of survival, of victory, and of a love that had walked through fire and come out gold. 6 months later, the hooly hood skyline was glittering in the twilight. On the balcony of the penthouse, the air was cool and crisp. Inside, the sound of a piano could be heard. Hannah was practicing, with Yuna turning the pages. They were laughing, safe, happy children. Nia stood at the railing looking out over the city. She wore a silk robe, her hair loose and free. She touched the scar on her shoulder absent-mindedly. It was a part of her now, a map of where she had been. Thinking about the past, Minjun's voice came from behind. He wrapped his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. He felt solid, warm, permanent. No, Nia said, leaning back into him. Thinking about the future. The council wants me to head the charity foundation. They say it's good optics, but I think they're just afraid to tell me no. Minjun chuckled, the sound vibrating against her back. They are terrified of you. Elder Choi told me yesterday that your glare is more dangerous than my gun. I think he might be right. I'm just a mom, Minjun, she said, turning in his arms to face him. I protect what's mine. And you are mine, he said fiercely. And I am yours. Nia looked at the man who had once been a nightmare to this city and saw the peace she had brought to his eyes. She looked at the reflection in the glass door, a big, beautiful, black woman held in the arms of a powerful king, with 2 daughters playing in the background. She hadn't changed. To fit the world. She had forced the world to expand until it could hold her. Come inside, Nia said, taking his hand. The girls want to show us a song. After you, Madame Park, Minjun said, stepping aside with a bow. Nia smiled, stepping through the doors, leaving the cold night behind. She walked into the warmth, into the light, into the empire she ruled, not with fear, but with a heart that beat loud enough to drown out the city.